Thanks very much for joining us for this webinar on coronavirus and climate justice. My name is Caroline Rance. I'm the Climate and Energy Campaigner at Friends of the Earth Scotland. And I'm also going to be joined tonight by my colleague Jess Cowell, Climate Campaigner, and Kate Whittaker, our activism organiser. So 2020 was supposed to be a really big year for us as climate campaigners. Last year, we saw this incredible rise of the climate movement in Scotland and across the UK and beyond. Following from the IPCC report in the autumn of 2018, we really saw climate soaring up the agenda. We had these new groups like Extinction Rebellion, School Strikers. Many of you watching this call will have taken action in one way or another on climate in the last year. Many of you have been doing it for much longer than that, but it really felt like we were advancing our demands. The movement was growing, and 2020 was going to be the year that, following the new Climate Act in Scotland, we were supposed to host the COP, the UN Climate Summit, COP26, in Glasgow in November. This was really supposed to be the year in which we were going to secure action on the government's climate commitments in Scotland. And then, of course, the coronavirus pandemic swept across not just Scotland and the UK, but the world. Now, the impacts of that pandemic have obviously been really stark, and they've hit so many people so hard, not least the most vulnerable in society, and people's first and foremost at the minute, people are just trying to figure out how to stay safe and stay well and look after themselves and their families. So I really appreciate that you've taken the time to join us for this webinar. But what we want to talk about during this call is to look a little bit about the impact of the coronavirus on climate change and why actually it's nothing to celebrate. We're going to take a look at the parallels between the coronavirus crisis and the climate crisis, and what we can learn from taking a justice view, a justice approach to both of these crises, which are distinct but interconnected. We'll also be looking at why this is a wake-up call moment for system change more widely, and talking about the beginnings of ideas for a green recovery from the economic impacts of this crisis, both in Scotland and beyond. And finally, we'll just have a bit of a check-in on plans for activism and how we can stay connected during this time. So first up, just want to talk about the impacts of the coronavirus on climate. And we've seen a lot of different stories being shared about how with planes grounded and cars off the road, that actually the coronavirus has been good for climate change. Now, of course, with so many people forced to stay in their homes around the world, factories have stopped, planes have been grounded, cars are staying parked in the drive, emissions have come down in places. So we have seen that very early stories in China, that China's emissions came down by 25% during their lockdown, and now 2 months on, their emissions are still lower than usual. This is some analysis from Carbon Brief, a website that some of you might be familiar with. And Carbon Brief have done some analysis that the coronavirus could actually trigger the largest ever annual fall in climate emissions, and that we could be looking at about a 5 to 6% drop in emissions this year alone, which is bigger than anything from a previous economic recession, previous financial crisis, or even during periods of war. And of course, we have seen that we've seen that oil demand has fallen. Oil demand has gone down by about 30%, and we've seen a pretty historic production cut, which has been agreed by OPEC, Russia, and other oil-producing nations. So it's understandable in these circumstances that people see these stories and they think that that this is a positive, and they think that this is something that we should be celebrating. But we have to remember that these emissions cuts come at huge, huge, huge social cost. First and foremost, this is a health crisis. So many people around the world have lost their lives, have lost their incomes, are struggling to survive. And that for us is not climate justice. We cannot celebrate emissions cuts or cuts to the climate or reductions in air pollution that come at such huge social cost. We just cannot celebrate that. We, Friends of the Earth Scotland, Friends of the Earth International, we demand, when we talk about the demand for climate action, we demand climate justice. And climate justice is about an approach to tackling the climate crisis that puts people first and foremost. It's about putting people's rights first and foremost. It's about equity. It's about tackling the climate crisis in a way that also tackles the interconnecting crisis of poverty, health, race, class, gender, economic inequality. It's striving for climate action that improves society while we tackle climate emissions. So we really need to be quite careful about some of the stories that we've seen shared saying that this pandemic, this lockdown has been good for climate emissions. We have to be careful because it plays into a narrative which some of you may have heard described of as an eco-fascist narrative. And it's about trying not to fall into the trap of talking about action which is good for the climate, but which comes at the cost of particular values, to make sure that when we're calling for climate action, we're calling for climate justice. And we have to think about ways in which we can advance our calls during this time, which are just and which are fair and which are sensitive to the pandemic and to the situation that many people find themselves in. And the other thing to say is that these emissions cuts will only be temporary. Pollution falls, emissions cuts, it's only temporary. We saw this during the 2008-2009 financial crash, that emissions dipped as economic activity was slowed and then rebounded again quite quickly afterwards. So the real chance for us as climate activists, as people who want to see a better world all around, is to think about how we get climate into the conversation, recovery, because the thinking about which industries to support during the economic recovery, which decisions to make as we come out of the economic impacts of this pandemic. Those decisions can either lock us into climate crisis, or they can set us on the path to climate justice and just transition. And we can only have sustainable, long-lasting decisions at the core. So that's just a kind of warning, a bit of a caution about why we as Friends of the Earth Scotland haven't been sharing some of these stories, and why we want to talk about the connections between climate justice and the coronavirus. So I'm going to pass over now to Jess Cowell, and she's going to take us through a little bit more of a systems view, a justice view of the interconnections between these two. And then I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and then we'll come back to myself to talk a little bit more about what's happening in the Scottish context with our government and our parliament. So over to Jess.
Hi, so I'm Jess Cowell. I'm the new climate campaigner at Friends of the Earth Scotland, and I'm going to talk a bit about justice framing and the parallels between climate and the coronavirus and the current situation, and being careful about how we frame the narrative, but also the way we discuss, analyse and respond to what we're seeing. So right now, the current situation with COVID is exposing who and what is prioritized in our society and why. So we can clearly see when crises strike, like COVID-19, who and what we rely upon in our society. So our healthcare system, who we rely on for well-being, for food, who provides important services, and then how those people and services are treated and what systems are failing them. So we can see that often people are disregarded as part of other wider agendas. So when we're talking about those systems, we're looking at, rampant economic growth and capitalism for the profit of the few, profit of the few over the many, and how they disregard the vulnerable. And we can see when something like huge like this happens, it's the people who are on the front lines and at the bottom of the society, people who are already being overlooked, who become increasingly dispensable. So the way people are treated in the workplace, people stopping being paid, the way corporations are disregarding workers' rights, the fact that people have to choose between going to work because they need their healthcare system instead of staying at home to protect themselves, which is what's happening in the US, for example. And we need to be very, very careful to avoid perpetuating this sort of utilitarian way of thinking. So leaving behind some people for the sake of the many, because it's, like Caroline said, highly false and unjust when we're talking about the way we need to respond to crisis in society. And we've seen these sort of highly problematic debates on who has to bear the burden when an emergency hits, and how some people are trampled over because the systems we have in place do not protect the majority of people. And when we discuss this and when we talk about global crisis, we really need to be thinking about casting a wider lens. And when we talk about the climate crisis and the parallels with COVID-19, there's often this sort of us and them dichotomy, where either a lack of cultural awareness or misinformation can lead to this othering or sort of blaming of other people. So, for example, one of the things that's been coming up quite a lot in the media is this idea of Chinese wet markets, they're to blame, or this isn't how we do things over here, or that's not right, that's something that we need to stop because that's not how we do it. And often that can be similar to how the climate crisis is framed of, we should be telling other people, those high emitters, to get their house in order first, or saying it's other people's fault. And those themes of us and them and who can bear the brunt and who should be told what to do are central to corona reporting, and also how the climate crisis can sometimes be framed in topics. So one of those things for me is the overpopulation myth. So instead of casting a sort of multifaceted approach to looking at things like consumption rates or historical emissions or exploitative systems, it gets reduced down to a very limited, unjust lens of this one idea of sort of blaming or not thinking about the way society is organized. And we really need to be looking about how, for us, how society is sort of systematically organized and how we benefit from global systems that also provide services for us. So when we look at things like carbon emissions, for example, this is something that's come out from WWF very recently. I think it was today or yesterday. So for example, in 2016, 54% of the UK's carbon footprint was domestically sourced, but the remaining 46% came from emissions released overseas to satisfy UK consumption. So these were things that were imported from manufactured goods such as food, clothes, and electronics. And, we need to be looking at how society operates and how we benefit from other systems that take place all around the world, but yet sometimes can be framed as, we're doing better, or it's their fault. And that's where justice, as Caroline said earlier, is really, really important in how we look about crises or climate crisis or the COVID crisis, because it's not purely about the physical world, but looking at human experience, human rights, ethics, historical oppression. And it's absolutely crucial to consider things like, when we mitigate or adapt to emergencies, these are influenced by factors like race, class, gender, political representation, geographical location, income. And examples of that can be, the coronavirus and its impacts will hit women, for example, the poor and the marginalized the hardest. Women are disproportionately affected by both crises because they tend to do more unpaid care and frontline work, for example. And it's absolutely not an acceptable trade-off in the reduction of emissions that is being discussed to allow some people in our societies to be left behind. And another thing to say here is that not all of our responses or experiences are going to be equal. So global north responses and our ability to put in place certain measures such as social distancing is a huge privilege that's not seen around the world, and we need to be thinking about justice in order to respond adequately and provide targeted help and responses that acknowledge not every single person is going to be experiencing the same situation or is vulnerable to the same thing, which is why we need international solidarity, and we need our governments and our environmental movements and our society to respond with justice principles at the very core of them, so we can do our fair share and acknowledge those social inequalities, and to make sure that we aim for a just society no matter what emergency is hitting. And then, you know, it's the system that underpins all of this. So a lot of what we're seeing in the media especially, and what, you know, even myself sometimes can think is, oh, when are we going to get back to normal? When are things, you know, when am I going to get the house? When can I continue on? But we can't go back to normal because normal wasn't working for the vast majority of people, and it continues to prioritize profit over lives and livelihoods. So something that I think we'll be able to share later in our resources section is a really great article from ActionAid, and they've said it a lot better than I can, but they've said that, you know, these emergencies expose the injustices of neoliberal economic systems in which powerful corporations prioritize profits over the common good and do all they can to avoid regulations. And it's the exact same system driving the climate and ecological crisis, which allows for the disenfranchisement and disregard to vulnerable people, that's underpinning the responses to what's happening right now with Corona. So what we need to be pushing for is building in safeguards to respond to things like this. So when and if other crises happen, this isn't a recurrent pattern of people being left behind and vulnerable people being trampled on and profits being prioritized. And, you know, I could talk about this for a very long time, but we're also seeing the overlapping of crises that's going to continue to worsen. So right now, in other places with what's happening with COVID, it's also overlapping with the climate crisis already. So there have been fires in the Ukraine, for example, and the system that we live under is not adequately equipped to deal with this, and it's not adequately equipped to provide just responses that look after vulnerable people. And I'll move on to Caroline, who'll be able to talk a bit more about, you know, what this really means for climate action in Scotland.
Thanks, Jess. So yeah, I just actually posted in the chat there that link to the article that Jess was talking about from Theresa Anderson of ActionAid. It's called Bringing Climate Justice Thinking to the COVID-19 Pandemic. It's really definitely worth a read. And for anyone who's watching this on record, we'll post the links to the things that we're talking about under the video on YouTube. And I'll also post a link to a statement from Friends of the Earth International. So Friends of the Earth Scotland is a member group of an international federation, and Friends of the Earth International put out a statement about why system change is a wake-up, why this coronavirus is a wake-up call for system change. So we'll post that in there as well. It's really worth a read, thinking about how we can draw the parallels out of these and think about bigger system change campaigning. So yeah, I'm going to bring it back a little bit to what's happening in Scotland. So as I mentioned at the beginning, COP26, which was to be our big moment this year as climate campaigners, that has been cancelled. COP has been put back until 2021. Now, they haven't given us a date, so we don't know what date it will be in 2021, but crucially, we do know that it will still be in Glasgow. So I think the really important thing for those of us who are planning to take action around that with our groups is that the moment is not lost, the moment is delayed. We don't know when exactly we'll find out, but we know that the the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, will be kind of having a review in August. So it may actually not be for some months that we find out when that's coming back, but it will come back. And Kate will talk a little bit more about activism and how we can stay connected in the next few months when we're not able to have these face-to-face meetings. And the other big thing that personally I was working on and that Friends of the Earth Scotland was following very closely was the Scottish Government's new climate change plan. Now, the climate change plan follows on from the new Climate Act that we got last year. That's the new legislation that set those targets of net zero by 2045 and 75% cut in emissions by 2030. And the climate change plan is basically the Scottish Government's plan for achieving those targets. So it runs from 2020 to 2032, and it details all of the things that they're supposed to do to cut emissions from buildings, transport, industry, agriculture, and it should add up to that 75% cut in emissions by 2030. It was supposed to be published on the 31st of April, and of course, that is now no longer happening. Again, we don't have a date for when it will come back, but our best estimates are that it will be autumn. And that's because of a number of factors. Number one is simply within the government, so much work is going into the immediate response to coronavirus. The cabinet are meeting, but they're obviously taken up with the COVID-19 response, and they're not really at this moment in time thinking about climate policy. And the other thing is that the Scottish Parliament is
Okay, we might have lost Caroline. As we said, she's got quite bad internet. She's living in quite a rural place. Are you back, Caroline?
I am back.
Great.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah, I'm living in, actually we don't have Wi-Fi. I have to tether off my phone, and sometimes just when the train goes past or when it's cloudy, my internet's not great. Sorry. So just to recap, yeah, the other reason that the climate plan will be delayed is because Scottish Parliament is not sitting at the moment. So to give you an update on that, the Parliament are sitting one day a week, and that is really just to deal with emergency legislation that's arising due to coronavirus. They're now having virtual First Minister's questions. So the First Minister and the leader of the parties are kind of meeting on Zoom like we are, or maybe not Zoom, but another platform. They are taking parliamentary questions. So MSPs can still put questions to the government about their climate plans and anything else, and the government will still respond to them. There's no committees meeting to sort of scrutinise that work. So we've lost quite an important function for getting these things through in the Scottish Parliament. So it's obviously completely understandable that these things are delayed at the minute. But what's interesting from our point of view as climate campaigners is that the Scottish Government said when they delayed the climate change plan that when it comes back, they want it to form part of the Scottish Government's Green Recovery Plan. So they're already thinking about the recovery from this pandemic as being part of a green recovery. So that's really interesting. They chose to speak about that really early on. We still, we don't know at this moment in time what that will look like, but it's definitely something for us to keep a watch on. And it's not just happening in Scotland, in the EU. There's been a sort of Green Recovery Coalition, which has been set up with 10 or 12 now environment ministers have come together and said that the EU should also be looking at green recovery and a European Green New Deal. So it's really, really important for us in the coming months, while we may not be actively campaigning in the way that we normally are, to still have a place to scrutinise, to still be keeping an eye on. We can still speak to our MSPs in time. At the minute, MSPs are obviously dealing with a lot of emergency cases in their constituency. But when they do come back to working on this stuff, it's really important for us as climate campaigners to be talking about what is the green recovery, who does it benefit. Whenever you're giving money after the pandemic, who is it going to? So is it, for example, Richard Branson is asking for a big bailout for his polluting airline instead of, supporting the workers. So there's a big call from lots of people in the US about bailouts being for people, not polluters. So we have to protect the workers and not the CEOs of these polluting industries. But also we want to make sure that the recovery puts us on the track to climate justice and a just transition. So a really important principle for Friends of the Earth Scotland is about just transition. We're working with trade unions as part of our campaign to make sure that as we move away from the fossil fuel industry in Scotland, the workers in those industries and the communities that they are part of that are currently dependent on these high carbon industries, so those people are supported with new jobs, with investment into their areas. So that for us has to be a really, really important part of the green recovery. It must have just transition at the core. And I know there's going to be a future webinar about just transition and a bit more about the idea of bailouts as well. So I won't go too much into that, but just to know that these are important themes that are coming up, and we'll be thinking about these at Friends of the Earth Scotland as well, and thinking about what are the key calls that we want to make of a green recovery. And of course, we'll share that all with you as well. And then I'm just going to pass to Kate just to share a little bit about activism and about how we can stay connected as climate campaigners during this time when we're not allowed to meet on the street.
Yeah, so as Caroline said, just a bit about like general movement stuff. So we've had the COP moment's been delayed. A lot of the work that we've been doing has been delayed. A lot of the campaigning that you might be doing in your local areas might have changed significantly or feel not as relevant anymore. But we are seeing quite a lot of these like openings or like areas where it feels like it's going to be really, really important for us to come together as a movement and demand this kind of system level change that we've been talking about for years. And a lot of people are starting to realize that is actually what we need. So at Friends of Scotland, we've tried to come up with a few ways to help the movement move into that space. So one of them is these weekly webinars that we're doing, and we're going to run through quite a few different topics. As I said, we did one on public transport last week. Next week, we're going to be talking about how corporations respond to crises, looking at past instances like the 2008 recession and the bailouts of the banks then, and looking at some climate crises across the world and how corporations have responded to that. And so we can try and skill ourselves up on, understanding how some people are responding to this and how we can be pushing for a fairer and just recovery. And then the other thing that what we're trying to do is create some kind of movement spaces for you and for other people in the climate movement. So one of them are these community chats that we're running. So they're going to be every Wednesday from 6 till 7:30 p.m. and every Friday from 2 till 3:30 p.m. The first one's tomorrow. And you can sign up. You can either just message me now if you want the link, or you can sign up on the Eventbrite and I'll post that. And basically the point of this is to have a kind of unstructured, unagendered space where people in the climate movement or who care about these issues can come together and talk about it in more detail, or just feel connected to something. And then the other thing is we've created a Slack channel so we can use an online discussion space, because as you've seen already, lots of people have been sharing links and ideas in the chat. And we wanted to create a space where people can can do that together. Some of you might not have those spaces where you can do that. So I'll post the links to both of those things in the chat as well. And yeah, if there's anything else that would be useful for you or your group, we're developing resources, and I'm doing some one-to-one support and coaching with groups as well. So feel free to drop me an email or a message about those things.